Historical underwear is honestly quite a fascinating topic because it's so different than the underwear that people are used to wearing in modern times. Well, the majority of people at least. Historically, underwear served more as a base layer to protect your outer garments from things like sweat and body odor, you know, all those human things that happen to all of us. I'm speaking quite generally here because there are definitely examples in history where the undergarments can vary quite a bit, but when it comes to European medieval underwear, it really is like another layer beneath your outer garments. Now, I've been fascinated by all sorts of aspects of historical fashion and historical living for a while now, and it turns out I've now made a handful of videos on historical undergarments and adjacent topics for this channel, so I thought why not dive into medieval underwear, specifically medieval women's undergarments because it varied between men and women. In Europe during medieval times, generally what was worn is a plain smock, and according to the medieval tailor's assistant, plain smock was worn from 1100 onwards. And by onwards, I believe they mean up until the end of the medieval period, at which point already the undergarments start to shift a little bit and become a shift. They shift into a shift. So I'm going to be making this type of plain smock because it's super versatile for the period and it will be able to work with all different centuries throughout the medieval times. And then for your legs, you would wear hose, which are basically like big long stockings, and then they would be tied with garters. For the hose, they were cut on the bias of a fabric, so a 45-degree angle, and the reason this was done is because it provides some stretch. So especially materials like wool, they're quite stretchy on the bias of the fabric. It makes a lot of sense that this would make for a much more comfortable fitting hose. And then another option would be to knit them. And during the medieval period, there was circular knitting, and it was done specifically on DPNs, or double-pointed needles. I should quickly mention here that there isn't really evidence for European medieval knitted stockings. There is, however, evidence of knitted stockings from Egypt already in the 12th century, and there's evidence for circular knitting of other garments in medieval Europe. Additionally, you start to see examples of knitted stockings appear in the 1500s in Europe, so just past the medieval European cutoff date. Because of this, I didn't feel it was that far-fetched to knit medieval hose or stockings, as they may possibly have existed in medieval Europe and we just haven't found evidence for them yet. Now, I just recently learned how to knit thanks to the sponsor of this video, Skillshare, which I will be talking about later on, and so I'm going to be making one pair cut on the bias and one pair knitted. Well, let's start the little adventure! So I started off my medieval undergarments journey with knitting, since I felt like this was going to be the thing that I'm least experienced with that is also of higher priority. I started by making a little test run to try and get gauge on 4mm needles, but actually had to move down to 2.75mm needles because the test was way too big. This almost felt like knitting with toothpicks. I'm following a free pattern called Pre-Literate Stockings made by Chris Lanning, and it's great. I decided to make these stockings out of Icelandic Lopi held double for a thicker result, which is one of my favorite materials to work with. When I was living in Iceland, I used to go buy Lopi at 2 a.m. at their 24-hour grocery store as I'd get the sudden urge to crochet. Crochet was actually my gateway into handicrafts, and yet these days I hardly ever crochet anymore. I kept on knitting and knitting, which felt clumsy at first because this is the first full project I'm knitting on double-pointed needles. I've only knitted part of a sleeve before, so it took a while to get comfortable, but eventually I had a fair bit of the top portion knitted. This little ridge of purl stitches was a happy accident, as I didn't realize I was knitting on the inside of the garment until I suddenly noticed the rounds bulking up. So I decided to just go with it. And then I couldn't knit just a plain stocking. I knew I wanted to do a little bit of stranded colorwork, which is actually one of my favorite things to knit. I went with a little leaf design from some green contrasting Lopi, and for stranded colorwork, I will knit with both hands at the same time, holding the contrasting color in my right hand. It's so much easier this way, and I highly recommend it. Once I reached further down the stocking, underneath the colorwork, I switched to holding the yarn single in order to reduce bulk at the foot. Then it came time to work the heel flaps separately. At this point, I could have continued on wooden double-pointed needles, but just to make my life a little easier and as to not lose stitches, I switched to some circular needles, except this part is just worked flat, so I would turn my work after each row. And then I picked up stitches and started to work the top of the foot. Eventually I got to the toe of the stocking, and the stitches kept becoming fewer and fewer, until I ended up with a complete stocking, and I was honestly ecstatic about how it turned out. So I just finished knitting my very first stocking, or actually my very first pair of knitted footwear. And I am so excited with how it turned out. It also fits me perfectly. I've never had custom fit stockings before, and it is so comfortable to have hosiery that's directly made for your body. And it took me about 10 to 12 hours to knit, so really not that bad. It's actually pretty wild to believe that I only started knitting back in January, so about 4 months ago, and I just have completely fallen in love with the craft. I actually learned how to knit thanks to the sponsor of today's video, Skillshare, and they helped me gain the confidence to learn to knit all sorts of different things. For example, about a month ago, I finished knitting my very first sweater, and that's all thanks to their class Next Level Knitting, Knit Your Own Chunky Cropped Sweater by Brandy Cheyenne Harper. In this class, you follow along with the different parts of making the sweater, from the neck to separating the sleeves from the body to finishing the rest of the body, because I feel like once you grasp the anatomy of how to make a sweater for the first time, then it's possible to make a bunch of other sweaters afterwards with ease. I also ended up making my very own pattern for the sleeves because I felt like the sleeve pattern that was offered was a little bit too modern for what I personally want to wear. And so I decided to create a sleeve pattern for these sort of leg of mutton go styled sleeves. And it was so much fun to do all the math and figure out how I could make it work. And with my newfound knitting confidence, I just couldn't stop there, so I ended up knitting a pair of cycling bloomers. And I actually came up with my own pattern for these. Now I guess I have an entire knitted Victorian cycling suit to wear next autumn. Skillshare is the largest online learning community for creatives, and not only that, but it's also designed for creatives by creatives. They have so many categories to explore at all different skill levels, including photography, film, animation, design, art, and illustration, and so many more. On top of knitting with confidence, Skillshare fuels continued growth in learning, with their thousands of other classes that you can take over time. And Skillshare loves to foster a learn-by-doing approach to teaching, which is why members can share their creations for feedback from both teachers and peers. The first 500 people to use my link in the description box will get a 1-month free trial of Skillshare. So get started today and you'll be knitting cycling sweaters and cycling bloomers and medieval hose in no time. Thank you so much again to Skillshare for sponsoring this video, and now I'm going to go and get some rest because I've been working really hard, and I'm going to come back in a couple of days and start working on the next parts of the undergarment set. I tried to weave some medieval garters on a rigid heddle loom my friend kindly let me borrow, and this was going to be my very first weaving project actually. After about 4 successful inches of weaving, and not to mention feeling quite happy and confident with my progress, I noticed my warp threads started snapping, so I realized I needed to try this weaving garters thing out in the future because I was running out of time and decided to focus more on the priority garments. It was a nice attempt. For hand sewing a smock, I drafted a pattern which is extremely simple. It's just a trapezoid and then 2 rectangles that get folded for sleeves. I was also meant to add in underarm gussets, but I completely forgot. Luckily, when I tried on the garment, I really didn't need them because of the way I cut the other pieces. I sort of forgot to video myself cutting the fabric, but you can at least see the shape of the pieces here. Then I proceeded to backstitch all the parts together with linen thread, as well as hem the bottom. Finally, I cut the neck hole and hemmed it. However, after a final fitting, I realized I had a little problem. Okay, so I finished the smock and I cut the neckline too wide. I wanted it to be a wider neckline, that way I could wear it even with a kirtle that has a wider neck, which I'm planning to make in the future. But I wanted my smock to be versatile, and yeah, I definitely cut the neckline too wide by about 2 centimeters maybe. So I need to figure out what to do. I think I'm going to take the piece that I cut out from the neckline when I was making the hole and I'm going to take part of it and then stitch it back to here so that way it extends over to here. So basically piece it back in. And that's going to be my solution, which I feel like is actually a pretty historically accurate one since people would do whatever they could to make modifications and adjustments to garments so they wouldn't have to waste fabric. And also so that things could go between people, like hand-me-downs for instance. I'm gonna just try this on over what I'm currently wearing so you can see the difference in the neckline. It's gonna look funny because obviously I wouldn't normally wear it over all this clothing, but you'll get my point. So I want my neckline about here, and it's here, so it's not coming off, like it's not so much that it's gonna fall off of my body. It's actually just barely hanging on my shoulders, but it definitely needs to be just a touch higher. Well, let's go and try and figure out a solution. And so instead of adding in an additional bit of fabric to make the neckline narrower, I realized an easy solution would be to just add some gathering stitches. The garment really didn't need that many to reduce the neckline width. This was way easier than piecing the neckline. Finally, it was time to hand sew some medieval hose. I was honestly feeling pretty intimidated about this process. Thankfully, one of my friends sent me pictures showing a simplified version of how she made her hose, and so I started to feel more confident. I took some mock-up fabric cut on the bias so that it would stretch, and I draped it around my leg, pinning it at the back of my calf so that it would stay in place, and then marking where the pins met with a pen. I did the same for the foot piece, except this time cut on the straight of grain for stability. This part was pretty awkward to wrap, I'm not going to lie, but eventually I made it work. I removed the pieces from my leg and then started to clean up the lines. I made both a symmetrical and an asymmetrical version of this pattern, but I thought the asymmetrical one would probably be more comfortable to wear, as it would account for both a left and a right foot. This is sort of a test pair, as in this is my first time sewing hose, so I used a wool fabric that isn't too precious from my stash. I'll make another pair at some point in the future from an even nicer wool fabric. I backstitched all the pieces together using silk thread as it's a little bit stretchier, and I also didn't secure my back stitches very tightly, so that way the stitches would move with the give of the bias cut fabric a little bit better, which would add to the comfort. I also hemmed the top part so that way they would look neatly finished from the right side. For the first one of the pair, I made a mistake with the toe and I sewed it in an alternate way where I followed the curve of the foot, which created a pointy toe. So for the second one, I did that part differently and I squared out the toe by basically pinching the tip of the fabric once the seam under the foot was sewn, and then I secured it across the top with stitches. And then they were done. I left the remaining knitting of the second stocking last, as I had a deadline for this video. With my deadline looming on the horizon, I spent a few hours knitting the foot as I was getting fairly close to being done with the garment, but eventually I felt overcome by tiredness. Well, it's about 3 a.m. right now, and my video comes out tomorrow. And I'm still not quite done with knitting the second pair of the second hose of the pair of hose. This is what I've got, so basically just have to finish the foot up to here. So about 4.5 more inches and then that whole toe. I think I'm gonna honestly have to call it a night and just review it partially done. Because, yeah, this is too much. How cute. I did not have second stocking syndrome or second sock syndrome, where it's like you don't want to do the second one because you already did the first one. Makes perfect sense. I didn't have that actually, surprisingly. I was kind of excited to make the second one. But yeah, I need to call it a night. I think this is just, it's time. I need to focus on the video part of things. And my whole house is just such a mess. Anyways. Wow, I'm so out of frame right now. I should be here if I want to be in the center. Anyways, I'm so tired at this point. Okay, good night everyone. See you soon for the big reveal. Okay, well it's not gonna be that big, it's just gonna be some medieval undergarments. It's not gonna be like some of the big reveals I've done in the past, but you get the point. At last, it was time to wear the garments together.